Part 13 of Ghosts and Family Legends, a volume for Christmas, by Catherine Crowe. This recording is in the public domain. Part 13, Legends of the Earthbound, the Swiss Lady's Story. "It was not I," said Madame de Gerstein. "It was my mother who saw the apparition you have heard of. But I can tell you all the particulars of the story if you have patience to listen to it." "You would be conferring a great favor," I said. "From what I have heard of the circumstance, I am already much interested." We were in the steamboat that plies between Vevey and Geneva when this conversation occurred, and as there could not be a more convenient opportunity of hearing the narration, we retired from the crowd of travellers that thronged the deck, and Madame de G. began as follows. My husband's father, the elder Monsieur Geirsteche, was acquainted with two young men named Zwengler. He was at school and at college with them, and their intimacy continued after their education was finished. When one was 14 and the other 10, they had the misfortune to lose both their parents by an accident. They were crossing the Alps when, by the fall of an avalanche, their carriage was overturned down a precipice, and they and their servants perished. The Zwenglers were people of good family but small fortune, and as they had always lived fully up to what they had, their property, when it came to be divided between their 4 children, for they had 2 daughters besides the sons I have named, afforded but an inadequate portion to each. But this misfortune was mitigated by their rich relations. A wealthy uncle adopted the boys, and an equally wealthy aunt took the girls. This was but just, for they had both been enriched by what ought to have been the inheritance of the other sister, the mother of these children, who, having married Monsieur Zwengler contrary to the wishes of her parents, was cut off with a shilling. This uncle and aunt had never married, for their father objected to every match that was proposed, as not sufficiently advantageous; whilst the brother and sister, taking warning by the fate of Madame Zwengler, preferred living single to the risk of incurring the same penalty. The daughters, having good fortunes, married early, and I believe did well enough. It is on the history of the sons that my story turns. As I mentioned, they were at the same school with my husband's father when the catastrophe happened to their parents, and he remembered afterwards the different manner in which the news had affected them. Alfred's grief was apparently stormy and violent; that of the other was less demonstrative, but more genuine. Alfred, in short, was secretly elated at the independence he expected would be the consequence of this sudden bereavement, and he lost no time in assuming over Louis the importance and authority of an elder brother. Louis was an enthusiastic, warm-hearted, and imaginative child, too young to appreciate his loss in a worldly point of view, but mourning his parents, especially his mother, sincerely. Alfred's hopes of independence were considerably abated when he found himself under the guardianship of Mr. Altorf, his uncle, a proud, pompous, tenacious, arbitrary man. On the other hand, he was somewhat consoled by the expectation of becoming the heir to his large fortune, the magnitude of which he had frequently heard descanted on by his parents. He soon discovered, too, that as the heir expectant he had acquired an importance that he had never enjoyed before; and in order to make sure of these advantages he neglected no means of recommending himself to the old gentleman, insomuch that Mr. Altorf being very fond of the study of chemistry, Alfred affected great delight in the same pursuit, sacrificing his own inclinations to shut himself up in his uncle's laboratory, with crucibles and chemicals that he often wished might be consumed in the furnace they employed. Louis, the while, pursued his studies, thoughtless of the future as young people usually are, but as he advanced in age he began to exhibit symptoms of a failing constitution, and as the law for which his uncle designed him required more study than was compatible with health, he was allowed to follow his inclination and become a soldier. With this view he was sent to Paris, and committed to the surveillance of a friend of his uncle there, who was in the French service. No profession being proposed for Alfred, he lived on with his uncle, confirmed in the belief that, though his brother, if he survived, would be remembered in the old man's will, he himself should inherit the bulk of the property. It was a weary life to him, shut up half the day in the laboratory that he detested, in constant association with an uncongenial companion. Moreover, up to the period of his being of age, he was kept almost entirely without money, and was excluded from all the pleasures suitable to his years. When he attained his majority, he became possessed of the small patrimony that devolved on him as the eldest son of his father, and was enabled to make himself some amends for the privations he had previously submitted to. Not that he threw off his uncle's authority, or became openly less submissive and conformable, but secretly he contrived to procure himself many relaxations and enjoyments, from which he had before been shut out; and in the attaining and purchasing these pleasures, he freely squandered all the proceeds of his inheritance, reckoning securely on the future being well provided for. His uncle inhabited a villa outside of Geneva on the road to Ferney, and seldom came into town, except when he visited his banker. His chemicals and other articles Alfred usually purchased, and he made acquaintance with several young men, whose society and amusements he availed himself of these opportunities to enjoy. One frosty day in December he was strolling arm in arm with some of these youths, when, on turning a corner, he unexpectedly saw sailing down the street before them the massive figure of his uncle, attired in his best chocolate suit, his hair powdered, and a long pigtail hanging down his back. The air of conscious importance and pomposity with which he strode along amused these gay companions, and they were diverting themselves at the old gentleman's expense, when his foot slipped on a slide, and he fell down. This was irresistible, and they all burst into a simultaneous shout of laughter. A passer-by immediately assisted him to rise, and as he did so he turned round to see from whence the merriment proceeded. Perhaps he had recognized his nephew's voice. At all events, Alfred felt sure he saw, if he did not hear, and thought it prudent to apologize for his ill-timed hilarity, which he sought to excuse by alleging that he had not at first been aware who it was that had fallen. Mr. Altorf looked stern, but as he said nothing and never alluded to the subject again, Alfred congratulated himself at having got off so well, and endeavored to efface any unpleasant impression that might remain by extra attention and compliances. Everything went on as usual till the following year, when one morning the old gentleman was found dead in his bed, and the medical men pronounced that he had expired in a fit of apoplexy. When the will, which was dated several years back, came to be read, it was found that after 2 trifling legacies and £5,000 to Louis, the whole estate was bequeathed to Alfred, whose breast dilated with joy as the words fell upon his ears, although it was no more than he was prepared for. But the first flush of triumph had not subsided when the lawyer arrested the incipient congratulations of the company by saying, "Here is a codicil, I see, dated the 14th of December last year." The company resumed their seats, and a cold chill crept through Alfred's veins as the reader proceeded as follows: "I hereby revoke the bequest here above made to my nephew Alfred Zwengler, and I give and bequeath the whole of my estates, real and personal, to my nephew Louis Zwengler. To my nephew Alfred Zwengler I give and bequeath my bust, which stands on the hall table. It is accounted a good likeness, and when I am gone it will serve to keep him merry. May he have many a hearty laugh at it on the wrong side of his mouth." The auditors looked confounded on hearing this extraordinary paragraph, but Alfred understood it too well. It is unnecessary to dwell upon his feelings. A quarter of an hour ago he was one of the richest men of his canton. Now there were not many poorer in all Switzerland than Alfred Zwengler. He had awakened from his long dream of wealth and importance and habits of expense to poverty and utter insignificance, while Louis, whom he had always despised, Louis over whom he had domineered and assumed the airs of an elder brother and a great man, had leapt into his shoes at one bound and left him grovelling in the mud. How he hated him! But he might die. What letters they had had from Paris reported him very sickly. He might be killed in battle, for Europe was full of wars in those days, but he might do neither, and at all events in the meantime what was Alfred to do? 1,000 wild and desperate schemes passed through his brain for bettering his situation, but none seemed practicable. The sole remnant of the property he had inherited from his father, that still remained in his possession, was a house in Geneva called l'Hôtel du Pont, that he had mortgaged to nearly its full value, intending at his uncle's death to pay the money and redeem it. It had been let, but now was empty and under repair, and the creditors talked of selling it to pay themselves. But Alfred induced them to wait, by giving out that as soon as his brother understood his situation, he would advance the necessary sum to relieve him. Perhaps he really entertained this expectation, but he had no precise right to do so, for he had never given Louis a crown piece, though the latter had suffered much more from his uncle's parsimony than he had, having inherited nothing whatever from his parents. However, Alfred wrote to Louis, dating his letter from that house, dilating on his difficulties and the hardness of his fate, and hinting that had he come into possession of his uncle's fortune, as he had every right to expect he should, how he should have felt it his duty to act towards an only brother. He received no answer to this appeal, and at first he drew very unfavorable conclusions from his brother's silence. But as time went on, and Louis neither appeared to take possession of his inheritance, nor wrote to account for his absence, hope began once more to dawn in the horizon; the brighter that no letters whatever arrived from him. Even the lawyers who had applied for instructions received no answer. The last letter his uncle had had from him had mentioned the probability of his joining the Republican forces in the south, if his health permitted him to do so. Altogether there certainly were grounds for anxiety, or hope, as it might be. I need not say which it was on this occasion. Rumors of bloody battles, too, prevailed, in which many had fallen. Even the creditors were content to wait, not being inclined to push to extremity a debtor who might be on the verge of prosperity, for it was not likely that Louis would make a will, and it was even possible that he might have died before his uncle. In either case Alfred was the undoubted heir, and accordingly he began once more to taste some of the sweets of fortune. Hats were doffed, hands were held out to him, and one or two sanguine spirits went so far as to offer loans of small sums and temporary accommodation. At length, affairs being in this state of uncertainty, the lawyers thought it necessary to investigate the matter, and endeavour to ascertain what was become of the heir. Measures were accordingly taken, which evidently kept Alfred in a violent state of agitation; but the result apparently made him amends for all he had suffered. It was proved that Louis, with his military friend, had joined the Republican forces in the south, but was supposed to have perished in an encounter with the Chouans. Nobody could swear to having seen him dead, but as the Republicans had been surprised and fallen into an ambush, they had been obliged to retreat, leaving their dead upon the field. This being the case, the property was given up to Alfred, a portion being sequestered in order that it might accumulate for a certain number of years for the purpose of refunding the original heir, should he, contrary to all expectation, reappear. If not, at the expiration of that term the sequestrated portion would be released. Alfred Zwengler was now at the summit of his wishes. and one might have thought would have felt the more intense satisfaction in the possession of his wealth from the narrow escape he had had of losing it. But this did not seem to be the case. He had formerly been very fond of society, though he had few opportunities of entering into it. But when he had, nobody enjoyed it more. Now he did not shun mankind. On the contrary, he sought their company, but he was moody, silent, and apparently unhappy. People said that he lived in constant fear of his brothers turning up again and reclaiming his inheritance. It might be so. Nobody knew the cause of the change in him, for he was uncommunicative even to his nearest acquaintance. One thing that gave color to this supposition was that he evidently disliked to hear Louis named, and whenever he was alluded to, he invariably asserted that he did not believe he was dead, and that he expected every day to see him come back. After saying this, it was observed that he would turn deathly pale, rising from his chair and walking about the room in manifest agitation. Preferring the town to the country, Mr. Zwengler had declared his intention of residing in his own house, which had lately been repaired under his special directions, and fitted up with all the appliances of comfort and elegance. But he was scarcely settled there before he took a sudden and unaccountable dislike to it, and offered it for sale. As it was an excellent property, Monsieur Geirsteche, my husband's father, bought it, and Mr. Zwengler purchased another house and removed his furniture thither. Mr. Geirsteche had no intention of living in the house. He bought it as an investment, for being situated in one of the best streets of the city, it was sure to let well, and accordingly it was not long before he found an eligible tenant in Mr. Baut, an eminent watchmaker of Geneva, who furnished it handsomely. He was very rich, and wanted it for his family, who expressed themselves delighted with their new residence. Nevertheless, they had not been in it 3 months before they expressed a desire to live in the environs of the city rather than in it. As Mr. Baut had taken a long lease of the house, he put up a ticket announcing that it was to be let. A gentleman from Lucerne, named Maurice, who had just married his sister's governess, and wished therefore to reside at a distance from his family, took it for 3 years, with the option of keeping it on for whatever terms he pleased at the end of that period. He gave directions for the furnishing, and when it was ready, they came to Geneva and took up their abode in their new house. At the end of a year they applied to Mr. Baut for permission to sublet the house. There was no such provision in the agreement, and Mr. Baut at first, we were told, objected, but consented after an interview with Mr. Maurice. But these frequent removals had begun to draw observation, and it began to be rumored that there was something objectionable about the Hôtel du Pont. The common people whispered that it was haunted. Some said it was infested with rats; others that it was ill-drained. In short, it got a bad reputation, and nobody was willing to take it. Mr. Maurice and his wife, who were gone to Paris for a few months, and had not yet removed their furniture, being informed of this, advertised it to be let furnished. So many strangers come to Geneva that there is no want of tenants for good furnished houses, and it was soon engaged by a French family from Dijon. They took it for a year, but at the end of that time they left it for a residence much inferior in every respect, and yet more expensive; the rent Mr. Maurice asked being very moderate. I don't know who were the next tenants, but family after family took the house, for it was a very attractive one. But nobody lived in it long. When Mr. Maurice 3 years had expired, Mr. Baut bought his furniture and continued to let the house furnished. He would have been glad to sell his lease, which was for 30 years, but nobody was inclined to buy it. "I now," said Madame de G., "come to that part of the story that concerns my mother. I have frequently heard the story from her own lips, and nothing made her so angry as to see people listen to it with incredulity. My grandfather, Mr. Colman, was, as you are aware, much given to the pursuit of literature, and as that is one that seldom brings wealth, his means were somewhat restricted, although he had a small independence of his own. He had 3 daughters and 2 sons, and when his family had outgrown their childhood, and my mother, who was the eldest, had attained the age of 17, they came to Geneva for the sake of giving the young people some advantages of education that he could not afford them in England. Besides, there was a good deal of literary society to be had here then, and the place was cheaper than it is now. Having no acquaintance, they applied on their arrival to an agent who offered them several houses, and l'Hôtel du Pont amongst the number. At first they were about to decline it as a residence beyond their means, but when the rent was named, they took it immediately. It was so far the best house they had seen, and the cheapest, that when the agreement was signed, they expressed their surprise to the agent at what appeared the unreasonable demands of the other proprietors. "Why, this house is particularly situated, sir," said the agent. "The gentleman who furnished it was obliged to leave Geneva almost immediately after he had settled himself here, and he being absent, and caring more for a good tenant than a high rent, we don't stand out for a price as people must do when they look to make money by a house." Mr. Colman congratulated himself on his good luck in finding such a liberal proprietor, and in a few days he and his family were comfortably established in the Hôtel du Pont. The only difficulty they had found was in procuring servants. They had 1 English maid with them, and at last they succeeded in getting 2 girls as cook and housemaid. The latter was a German, who had been brought there by a family who had gone on to Italy, and the former was a Frenchwoman who had married a gentleman's valet, and had followed him from Paris to Geneva. As soon as everything was arranged, they resumed their usual habits, one of which was, that for an hour or 2 before they went to bed, the father read aloud to them, in a room they called the library it was, in fact, his writing room, whilst the ladies worked. A few evenings after they had recommenced this practice, a discussion arose between Mr. Colman and his eldest daughter Mary as to the precise meaning of a French word, and the dictionary had to be appealed to decide the question. Mary said it was in her bedchamber, and left the room to fetch it. The library was on the ground floor, and the staircase was a broad, handsome one as far as the first flight. It had been made by Alfred Zwengler when the house was repaired, and there was a wide landing at the top, the whole being lighted sufficiently for ordinary purposes by a lamp that hung in the hall. The stairs were very easy of ascent, and my mother, I mean Mary, for she was afterwards my mother, who was a lively, active girl, was springing up 2 steps at a time, when, to her amazement, she saw a gentleman in uniform standing on the landing above. She stopped suddenly, but as he did not appear to notice her, she continued to ascend, concluding it was some stranger who had got into the house by mistake, for he did not look a thief. But when she reached the landing, he was gone. She stood, at first, bewildered. There were 4 doors opening into bedrooms, but they were all shut, and after thinking a moment she concluded it was the shadow of some cloaks and hats and sticks that were hanging in the hall that had deceived her. She did not pause to consider how this could be, but turned into her own room, felt for the book, which she remembered to have left on her bed, and ran downstairs again to her father. So occupied with the disputed question that for the moment she forgot what had happened, and as her father resumed his reading immediately, she did not mention it. When they were going to bed, and they were lighting their candles in the hall, she said, "You can't think what a start I had this evening when I went for the dictionary. It must have been the shadow of those cloaks and things, but I could have declared I saw an officer in uniform standing at the top of the stairs. I even saw his epaulette, and the colour of his clothes." "La, Mary," said one of the younger ones, "weren't you frightened?" "Frightened? No. Why should I be frightened at a shadow?" "Or a handsome young officer either?" said one of the boys. She playfully gave him a tap on the head, and they all went to bed, thinking no more of the matter. The kitchen was at the back of the house, on the same floor as the library, and a few evenings after this occurrence, one of the girls being in the store room, heard sounds of distress proceeding thence, and on opening the kitchen door to inquire what was the matter, she saw Jemima, the English girl, in hysterics, and the other two standing over her, sprinkling her face with water. They said that she had left the kitchen to fetch some worsted to mend her master's stockings, but that before she could have got up the stairs she had rushed back again, thrown herself into a chair, and gone off, as they expressed it. On hearing the noise, Mr. and Mrs. Colman joined them, but for a long time they could extract nothing from her, but that she had seen something. My grandfather asked if it was a rat or a robber, but she only shook her head, and it was not until they had all left the kitchen and sent her a glass of wine, that she was sufficiently collected to tell them that, as she got to the foot of the stairs, she saw an officer in uniform going up before her. He had his cap in his hand, and his sword at his side, and supposing he was some friend of her master's, she was going to follow him up, but when he reached the landing, to her surprise and horror, he disappeared through the wall. When the family heard this, combining it with what had happened to Mary, though the circumstances had never been mentioned in the hearing of the servants, nor indeed even alluded to a second time, they began to ask themselves whether it was possible any such person could get into the house; and they examined every part of it with care, but found nothing that threw a light on the mystery. After this, Jemima was afraid to go upstairs alone at night, and Gretchen shared her fears. But the Frenchwoman laughed at them both, and said she should like to see a ghost that would frighten her. One night, however, about 9 o'clock, when the family were in the library, they suddenly heard a great noise upon the stairs, as if something had fallen from the top to the bottom; and when they all rushed out to see what was the matter, they found the cook lying across the lower step in a state of insensibility, and the coal scuttle upset beside her, with its contents scattered around. They carried her into the library, and when she revived, she insisted on immediately leaving the house. She would not sleep in it another night on any account whatever, and away she went. Gretchen and Jemima said they were sure she had seen the ghost, but was too proud to own it, after turning their fears into ridicule, and the family began to be very much perplexed. My grandfather had a truly philosophical mind, and did not think it a proof of wisdom to hold decided opinions on subjects that he had not investigated. He had never believed in spiritual appearances, but he had never thought seriously on the subject at all, and did not feel himself qualified to assert that such things were impossible. Certainly it was a singular coincidence that Jemima's description of the apparition exactly coincided with what my mother had seen, and though the Frenchwoman had confessed to nothing, yet it was at the same hour and the same place that she had taken fright. He tried whether, by placing the cloaks and lamps in certain relative positions, he could produce any reflection that might deceive the eye, but there was not the most remote approximation to such a thing. In short, he perceived that that explanation of the appearance was altogether inadmissible. "Well," he said, "if anybody sees this figure again, I beg they will call me." They were not a nervous family, I suppose. My mother was quite the reverse, I know. I never saw anybody with more courage. At all events, they do not seem to have been alarmed, though both the boys afterwards saw the same figure on the same spot, and ran to call their father. But when Mr. Colman came, it was gone. However, they declared they had seen it cross the landing, and that it had seemed to them to walk through the wall, just as Jemima had described. Some weeks after this, towards the same hour, as Mr. Colman was about to commence reading aloud, he discovered that he had left his spectacles in the pocket of his coat when he dressed for dinner, and my mother, who was always alert and active, left the room to fetch them. Presently she re-entered the room, pale and somewhat agitated, but perfectly collected, and said that when she had ascended the stairs about half way, she heard a slight rustle above, which caused her to raise her eyes, when she saw distinctly the same figure she had seen before. "I was not frightened," she said, "and I stopped with one foot on the next stair, and looked at it steadily, that I might be sure I was not under a delusion. The face was pale, and it looked at me with such a sad expression that I thought if it was really a ghost it might wish to say something, so I asked it." "Asked it!" they all exclaimed. "What did you say?" "I said, if you have anything to communicate, I conjure you, speak." "And did it?" "No," answered Mary, "but it made a "Good heavens!" said Mrs. Colman, "do you know what you're saying?" "Perfectly," said Mary calmly. With one hand it pointed to the wall, just where Jemima and the boys saw it go in, and with the other it made a movement as if it was going to strike the wall with something heavy. "Perhaps there's some money buried there," said one of the boys. Mr. Colman, who had hitherto been a silent but amazed listener to his daughter's narration, asked her what the gesture appeared to signify. "It was as if it wanted the wall to be pulled down; at least, I thought so. I wish I had asked if that was what it wished, but I had not presence of mind. If I see it again, I will." "But we could not pull down the wall, you know, my dear," said Mrs. Colman. "I suppose we might, if we engaged to build it up again," suggested one of the party. "But if we told anybody, we should not get the money," said the boys. "Hush!" said Mary, "don't speak in that way. Think what a solemn thing it is. I shall never forget his face, never to the day of my death. And it looked at me so gratefully when I spoke to it, and then it disappeared into the wall." Of course, this extraordinary occurrence formed the subject of conversation for the rest of the evening, and Mr. Colman narrowly questioned his daughter with regard to the particulars; but her story was always consistent, and as he had a very high opinion of Mary's courage and sense, the circumstance made so much impression on him, that he set about making inquiries as to the owner and antecedents of the house. It was difficult to obtain much information, for saying a house is haunted is an injury to the landlord, and sometimes brings people into trouble; but he ascertained that it had had several tenants, that nobody had stayed in it long, and that one of the persons who had inhabited it for a short time was Mr. Bautte himself, whereupon he resolved to pay him a visit. Mr. Bautte, as I have mentioned, was a watchmaker, and though very rich, still attended to his trade, so that it was easy to obtain an interview with him. Mr. Colman called at his place of business, which was not a shop, but a room on the first floor of a private house. He asked him about the engraving of a seal that he had to his watch chain; and then, having ascertained which was Mr. B., he told him he was his tenant. Mr. B. bowed and said, "I hope you like the house, sir." My grandfather said that, perhaps he might not have observed it, but for what had happened, but that he fancied this was said with a sort of misgiving, as if he was conscious that there was something objectionable about the house. "Why," said my grandfather, drawing him rather aside, "I like the house very much, but there's one great inconvenience about it, we can't get any servants to stay with us. One has left us already, and the others have given us warning, and nobody seems willing to come in their places. I understand you lived in the house yourself a short time. May I ask you if you found any similar difficulty?" "Well, sir," said Mr. Bautte, trying to look unconcerned, "you are aware how ignorant and foolish such people are. I fancy from the construction of the house that the sounds from the next door penetrate the walls." "We hear no sounds," said Mr. Colman. "I have heard no complaints of any. Did any of your family ever say they saw anything extraordinary there?" "Well, sir, since you put the question so directly, I can't deny that the female part of my family did assert something of the sort, but women have generally a tendency to superstition, and are easily terrified." "Very true," said Mr. Colman, "but I should take it as a great favour if you would tell me what they said they saw. I have no idea of leaving the house, you need not be afraid of that. And of course I shall not mention this conversation to any one. What did they say they saw?" Mr. Bautte, thus exhorted, confessed that his family, and everybody who had lived in the house, asserted that they had seen the apparition of a young man in uniform, who always appeared on the stairs or the landing; adding that he himself had never seen it, although he had put himself in the way of it repeatedly, and he firmly believed it was some extraordinary delusion or optical deception, though it was impossible to account for its affecting so many persons in the same way. My grandfather then told him what had occurred in his family, especially to his eldest daughter, in whose testimony he assured Mr. Bautte he placed the greatest reliance; and he ventured to propose an examination of the spot where the figure was said invariably to disappear. At first Mr. Bautte laughed at the idea; for, besides his scepticism, which made him unwilling to take any proceeding that countenanced what he considered an absurd superstition, he urged that the staircase and landing in question were a very recent erection, being one of Mr. Zwengler's improvements when he repaired the house. However, after a short argument, wherein my grandfather represented that nobody but the parties concerned need know the real reason for what they did, that the expense would be small, and the possible result beneficial to the property, Mr. Bautte consented, provided Mr. Geierstecke made no objection, he being still the owner of the house. Mr. Geierstecke, who you know was my husband's father, was aware that the Hôtel du Pont had frequently changed its tenants, but was quite ignorant of the cause. He had no immediate interest in the matter, as Mr. Bautte held a 30 years' lease, and he naturally assumed that these frequent changes were purely accidental. Everybody who became acquainted with the house had a strong motive for keeping the secret; for, besides the ridicule and penalty they might have incurred, they all wanted to get it off their hands. It's true that amongst the servants and common people of the neighbourhood there were strange whispers going about, the source of which it would not have been easy to trace. Aglasier said he knew a man, who had heard another declare that he was acquainted with a bricklayer who had helped to build the staircase, who used to say he did not wonder that nobody could live in the Hôtel du Pont, and that it was his opinion that nobody ever would be able to live in it, and a woman who kept a shop opposite had been heard to say that she saw somebody go into the house that never came out again; but whenever she alluded to this subject, her husband always reproved her, and told her she did not know what she was talking about. This gossip had, however, never reached Mr. Geierstecke, and he was exceedingly surprised when Mr. Bautte communicated Mr. Colman's proposal, and the reason of it. He immediately called upon my grandfather, who recited the circumstances to him, and introduced my mother; from whose lips he wished to hear the account of her two rencontres with the ghost; and also a particular description of its appearance. At the commencement of his visit he was inclined to be jocular on the subject; but after he had seen my mother, and heard her describe the dress of the apparition, which was that of an officer in the Republican army of France, he seemed a good deal struck, and became furious. He said he did not believe in ghosts, though he had heard people affirm that they had seen such things. He always supposed them to be under a delusion, but that my mother's testimony was so clear, and from the account of her family she was so unlikely a person to be deceived, that he felt bound to give his assent to the proposed investigation, only stipulating for entire secrecy, and that he might fix the day for it himself. "I'll speak to a builder," said he. "Mr. Bautte, of course, will wish to be present, and perhaps I may bring a friend with me." As I mentioned before, he had been early acquainted with the Zwengler's, and betwixt him and Alfred the intimacy still continued, although the latter was by no means the pleasant companion he had been formerly. Mr. Geierstecke, concluding that his uncle's will, and the sudden vicissitudes of fortune he had experienced, had affected his spirits, pitied him, and had often endeavoured to argue him out of his depression, but with little effect. I have heard him say that after he left my grandfather's house on that day, he went to Mr. Zwengler's with the intention of telling him the circumstances I have related, and also of giving him notice of the impending investigation. But when he had got to the door, and his hand was upon the bell, he shrunk from the interview. Not, he said, that he admitted a suspicion, on the contrary, he repelled it, but he could not overcome an uneasy feeling at the striking resemblance between Louis Zwengler and the ghost, if ghost there was, as described by my mother. He feared that, if his words did not betray this feeling, his countenance would, and he could not face Alfred in this state of mind. So he turned from the door and went home. Still he felt he could not allow this thing to be done without warning his friend of their intention, and he sat down to write him a letter. But it was a difficult thing to communicate. At least he somehow found it so. He could have mentioned it jocularly, but that, under all the circumstances, he could not do so, and he had torn up 2 or 3 unsuccessful efforts, when the door opened, and the servant announced Mr. Zwengler himself. My father-in-law told me that he felt his knees tremble and his cheeks turn pale when he rose to receive his visitor, who, seemingly rather more cheerful than usual, said he had called to ask him why he did not come in to-day when he was at his door. "I was at the window," said he, "and was quite disappointed to see you turn away." This was too good an opportunity to be lost, and Mr. Geierstecke answered that it was quite true, and that he had actually had his hand upon the bell, when he thought it was useless troubling him with such nonsense. "What nonsense?" asked Zwengler. "It's about that house I bought of you," said Mr. Geierstecke. "People say they can't live in it," adding, while he affected to laugh, "they say there's a ghost in it, and they want to pull down the staircase to look for him." "How absurd!" said Mr. Zwengler. "And are you going to do it?" But the voice sounded as if there was something in his throat. "We are," replied Mr. G. "Mr. Bautte has never been able to keep a tenant, and I can't refuse, for it appears they all assert the same thing. Even Mr. Bautte's family would not live in it. They say they see—" "Ha, ha!" laughed Zwengler, rising suddenly, and pushing back his chair in a hurried manner. "But I must leave you. I've an appointment. I merely called, as I passed the door, to ask why you'd not come in. Bless me, I'm late," he added, as he looked at his watch, and he hurried out of the room crying good night as he disappeared. Mr. Geierstecke used to say that he believed that he, Mr. G. himself, continued standing on the same spot like a statue for nearly half an hour after the door closed on his visitor. "I had scarcely had time to rise from my chair," he said, "before he was gone, and I felt paralyzed. I did not know what to do. I wished I had never bought the house, and I lay awake all night thinking of horrors, and then trying to persuade myself that perhaps there was no cause for my apprehension after all. I saw nothing more of Zwengler, though I frequently passed his house purposely, and at length the day arrived which I had, not without design, fixed at the interval of a week from my first visit to Mr. Colman. We all assembled at the appointed time, with a respectable workman whom I was in the habit of employing, to whom we accounted for our proceeding by alleging that there was a bad smell sometimes, which we thought might proceed from a dead rat. I never felt more nervous and agitated in my life than while the man was demolishing the wall, and we were waiting the denouement; while Mary, the heroine, stood pale and earnest, with her eyes eagerly fixed on the spot. "We had better have a light, sir," said the mason presently. "There is something here." One of the boys went for a light, while silent and breathless they waited its arrival. When it came it disclosed a fearful sight. There lay, huddled up, as if thrust in at haste, the bones of a perfect skeleton, and what appeared to be burnt remnants of clothes. Before they touched anything, Mr. Bautte sent for the police, and these sad relics were removed by their officers. There was no means of discovering how life had been taken, but the medical men said that some strong chemical preparation had been used to consume the flesh and clothes and prevent any bad odor. Everybody knew the Zwenglers and their history, and on this discovery the Préfet sent for my mother, and took her deposition as to the appearance of the figure she had seen. He also examined Jemima and the Frenchwoman who had left our service, and the testimony of all parties coinciding, he issued an order to arrest Alfred. But when they went to his house he was not there. The servants said he had been absent nearly a week, that he left, saying he was going on business to Dole, and his stay was uncertain. He had taken no baggage with him but a carpet bag. A messenger was dispatched to Dole, but nothing was known of him there, and the inquiries that were instituted at the messageries and the voitures threw no light on his mode of conveyance, if indeed he had left Geneva. Various people who had lived in the house now confessed to have been troubled with the same apparition, and several amongst the neighbors of the lower ranks avowed that they had strong suspicions that Alfred Zwengler had not come fairly by his fortune, alleging different reasons for their opinion, one of which was singular. It was that a little deaf and dumb girl who lived near him described to her mother that when he passed their door she always saw him as enveloped in a black cloud. Howbeit, Alfred Zwengler never appeared more, and it was generally thought that, terrified by the impending disclosure, he had thrown himself either into the lake or the river, to escape it. He left no will, and the fortune went to his sisters; but this strange circumstance resulted in my mother's marriage to Monsieur de Beauregard, the prefect, who was so captivated by her courage that he made her an offer immediately; and the acquaintance with Mr. Geirsteck, thus commenced, led to my marriage with his son. In answer to my inquiry of how it was supposed the murder was committed, Madame de G. said the conjecture was that Louis had made his escape from the Chouans and returned unexpectedly, a neighbor even testified to having seen him enter the house one night at the time it was under repair, and that his brother by a sudden and dreadful impulse had struck him down unawares. One of the masons who had been employed in building the staircase, but who was killed by a fall shortly before the discovery, had been heard to hint that before he died he must unburden his mind of a secret that weighed heavily on his conscience. "Not that the guilt lies on my soul," he used to say, "but perhaps it's a sin to hold my tongue." However, he had no time to speak, but one came from the grave to tell the tale, and bear awful witness against the unhappy Alfred Zwengler. Part 13